Picture it for a moment. A gray, salt-bitten coastline stretching nearly 2,400 miles, from the fjords of Norway down to the sun-baked border of Spain. Concrete pillboxes squat in the dunes like prehistoric beasts, their gun slits black and unblinking. Steel hedgehogs rust in the surf. Mines, hundreds of thousands of them, sleep beneath the sand, waiting patiently for a boot, a wheel, a young man's leg. The Germans called it the Atlantic Wall, and in the spring of 1944, the men who built it believed it was the closest thing modern engineering had ever come to the impossible. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had personally walked these beaches. He had ordered the obstacles, the bunkers, the killing zones. He spoke with the cold certainty of a man who had already seen the future. The first 24 hours of any invasion, he told his staff, would be decisive. The Allies, he promised, would drown in their own blood before a single tank touched dry French soil. Behind him stood Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the old Prussian aristocrat, sipping cognac in a chateau outside Paris, openly mocking the Americans. They were grocers, he sneered. Shopkeepers playing at war. The English Channel itself, he said, would do half the killing for them. The sea, the storms, the cliffs, the guns. There was no possible way, no rational calculation on Earth, by which the Allies could cross that water and live. And the man tasked with proving them wrong, the man whose name would be whispered in every Allied capital on Earth, was not some battle-hardened gladiator. He was not a Patton, not a Montgomery, not a fire-breathing warrior with medals jangling on his chest. He was a balding, soft-spoken son of a Kansas creamery worker, a staff officer who, until very recently, had never commanded so much as a platoon in actual combat. He had never been shot at. He had never killed a man. He had never even smelled a battlefield. And now, the fate of Western civilization, the lives of millions, and the entire question of whether freedom would survive the 20th century rested entirely on a decision he, and he alone, would have to make. A decision so heavy, it would physically break him before he ever uttered the words. If you are finding this deep dive into historical leadership valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of meticulous storytelling is worth showing to more people. So, if you appreciate slow, careful history told, with respect for the men who lived it, please consider hitting that button. Now, back to 1944. To understand the weight of what Dwight David Eisenhower carried into that storm-lashed June, you have to understand where he came from. And the truth is, he came from nowhere. He was born in Denison, Texas, raised in Abilene, Kansas, in a small white house with a coal stove and not much else. His family were river brethren, plain living, Bible reading, pacifist by tradition. There was no military lineage, no general grandfather, no silver spoon. He went to West Point not out of burning ambition, but because it was free. A young man from Abilene took whatever education he could find. When the rest of his generation went to France in 1917 and 1918, when his classmates were earning silver stars in the Argonne and the Marne, Eisenhower was stuck at Camp Colt in Pennsylvania, training tank crews who would never see combat. The war ended before he ever got near it. For a young officer in that era, missing the Great War was a quiet kind of professional death sentence. The medals went to other men, the promotions went to other men, the legends were built on other men's chests. And so, throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, Eisenhower languished. He was a major for 16 years. 16 years. He served in Panama. He served in the Philippines, where he spent long, miserable years as the chief of staff to General Douglas MacArthur, a man whose ego could fill a continent. MacArthur was theatrical, vain, addicted to his own reflection. He treated Eisenhower like a glorified clerk. Eisenhower, in his private diary, called MacArthur impossible, exhausting, and at times simply unbearable. But here is the thing nobody noticed at the time. While the loud men strutted and postured, This quiet, balding officer was learning something the others never bothered to study. He was learning logistics. He was learning supply lines, railway capacities, fuel consumption, the boring, granular arithmetic of how you actually move an army. He was learning how to manage egos, how to soothe a general's wounded pride at breakfast and still get him to follow orders by lunch. He was, without knowing it, building the exact skill set the coming war would demand. The genius of compromise, the patience of a saint, the mind of an accountant, and the soul of a diplomat. When the world finally caught fire in 1941, the boring staff officer from Kansas turned out to be the only man in the United States Army who actually knew how to plan a global war. His ascent was meteoric, almost surreal. From an unknown colonel to Supreme Allied Commander, in barely 18 months, he leapfrogged over 366 officers who outranked him. But the rank meant nothing compared to the burden. By the spring of 1944, Operation Overlord existed only on paper, but the numbers were staggering enough to break a man just reading them. Nearly 3 million Allied soldiers staged across southern England, almost 7,000 ships and landing craft, over 11,000 aircraft, 15,000 tons of bombs to be dropped in the opening hours. The largest amphibious operation in the history of the human species, all hinging on a single roll of the dice across one of the most treacherous stretches of water on Earth. And every single piece of it, every bullet, every bandage, every gallon of fuel, every man, was Eisenhower's responsibility. But the Germans, terrible as they were not his hardest problem. His hardest problem sat at his own table. Winston Churchill, the great lion, was haunted by Gallipoli. He had seen what happened when amphibious assaults went wrong. He pressed Eisenhower again and again, suggesting alternatives, sideshows in Norway, in the Balkans, anywhere but those French beaches. Charles de Gaulle, exiled and proud, treated Eisenhower with frosty suspicion, convinced the Americans intended to occupy France rather than liberate her. And then there were the generals. George Patton, brilliant, profane, a man who treated war like a personal religious experience, kept embarrassing the entire command with reckless speeches. Bernard Montgomery, the British Field Marshal, wore his arrogance like a uniform. He believed, openly, that he should be running the invasion himself, that the American in charge was a glorified office manager. Every meeting was a war within the war. Every plan, a negotiation. Every personality, a landmine. Eisenhower absorbed all of it. He smiled. He listened. He compromised. He held the alliance together with nothing but charm and an iron stomach. But the stomach was lying. Inside, he was disintegrating. His blood pressure climbed into ranges his doctors found alarming. He was smoking 4 packs of Camels a day, sometimes lighting the next from the embers of the last. His weight dropped. The skin under his eyes turned the color of old paper. His hands, when no one was looking, shook. He developed a ringing in his ears that never fully stopped. The Germans, smug in their concrete bunkers, had no idea that the man trying to break their wall was, by any reasonable medical standard, being slowly killed by his own decision tree. Across the channel, Rommel and von Rundstedt continued to laugh. The Allies, they said in their staff conferences, would never come in bad weather. The Allies needed a full moon for the paratroopers, a low tide for the obstacles, calm seas for the landing craft. The window was narrow, and the Germans had already calculated when it would open. They would be ready, they were certain. The sea, they repeated like a prayer, would turn red, and then came June. The original date was set for June 5th, 1944. Everything, every ship, every soldier, every prayer was aimed at that single dawn. And then, on June 4th, the sky over the English Channel collapsed. A storm of historic violence came roaring out of the North Atlantic, winds gusting over 30 knots, waves heaving the landing craft like toys, rain so thick it stripped visibility down to nothing. the kind of weather no sane commander would ever launch a fleet into. In his chateau in Germany, Rommel looked at the barometer, nodded once, and made a decision of his own. He would drive home to Herlingen for his wife Lucy's 50th birthday. He would buy her a pair of gray suede shoes. The weather, he was certain, was his ultimate shield. Meanwhile, at Southwick House, a stately manor near Portsmouth, Eisenhower paced. The room was small, lit by a single hanging lamp, the windows lashed by horizontal rain. Maps covered every wall. His commanders sat in heavy chairs, smoke curling toward the ceiling. Montgomery, in his black turtleneck. Admiral Ramsay, calm and grave. Air Chief Marshal Tedder. Bedell Smith, the Chief of Staff. And then, the man whose words would decide everything. Group Captain James Stagg, a tall, gaunt Scottish meteorologist, walked into that room carrying a folder that, in retrospect, may have been the most important piece of paper in the 20th century. Stagg had been arguing with American and British forecasters for days. The Americans saw doom. The British saw a possibility. Stagg, threading the needle, had spotted something. A tiny break, a thin sliver, a window of barely 36 hours, opening on the morning of June 6th, where the wind might drop just enough, the cloud cover lift just enough, to make the impossible possible. He delivered the briefing in a quiet, measured voice. When he finished, the room went absolutely silent. You could hear the rain hammering the glass. You could hear the floor creak. You could hear the small, careful breath of each man in that room. Eisenhower walked to the window. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked back. He polled the room one by one. Montgomery wanted to go. Ramsay needed the answer within 30 minutes or the tides would slip beyond reach. Tedder was uncertain. Bedell Smith called it a gamble. Eisenhower listened. He sat down. He stared at the floor, for what witnesses later said felt like an eternity, though it was perhaps 45 seconds. The fate of 156,000 men about to cross that water rested on the next breath he would take. The fate of Europe, the fate of his own name, forever, in history. And then he looked up, and he said 4 simple, plain American words. "Okay, let us go." The room emptied within minutes. Officers ran to telephones. Orders flashed across the night. The greatest armada ever assembled began to move. But what almost no one knew, what would not be discovered until years later, was what Eisenhower did next. He went back to his small trailer. He took a scrap of paper, and in his careful, looping handwriting, he wrote a letter he prayed would never be sent. It read, in essence, that the landings had failed, that he had withdrawn the troops, that the decision to attack at this time and place had been based on the best information available. And then came the line that defined the man. "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He folded the paper. He put it in his wallet. He carried it with him through the longest day of the longest century. He was 45 years old, and he had just signed his own potential execution warrant for history. The hours that followed were a special kind of hell. The Armada was crossing now. 5,000 ships, slicing through a sea that was still rough, still mean. The paratroopers were loading. The C-47s were warming up on airfields scattered across England. And Eisenhower, the man who had ordered it all, could do absolutely nothing. The decision was made. The wheels were turning. He was a passenger now on a train of his own design. He could not sleep. He drank coffee that had gone cold hours before. He smoked, and smoked, and smoked. And then, in the late evening of June 5th, he climbed into a staff car and drove to Greenham Common Airfield to visit the men of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, his paratroopers. His own intelligence officers had told him these men, dropping behind enemy lines in darkness, were facing casualty estimates as high as 70%, 70 out of every 100. He walked among them in the gathering dusk as they blackened their faces with burnt cork, checked their reserve chutes, joked grimly with each other. He spoke to them in his soft Kansas voice. He asked them where they were from. "Texas, sir." "Wisconsin, sir." "Brooklyn." He smiled at them. He made small jokes. And when the trucks pulled away to take them to the plains, when the last engine had faded into the dark, an aide standing nearby looked over and saw that the Supreme Commander's eyes were full of tears. He whispered something. The aide barely caught it. "It is very hard," he said, "to look a man in the eye when you may have just killed him." What came next was the breaking of the wall. It did not break easily. At Omaha Beach, the cost was nearly catastrophic. Young men from Virginia, from Pennsylvania, from small towns nobody had heard of, were cut down in the surf. Boats sank. Tanks drowned. The sand turned the color Rommel had promised. For a few terrible hours that morning, it looked as though the Germans might be right after all. But the wall was bitten. It was shelled. It was bled through. Men climbed those cliffs with their fingernails. Engineers blew the obstacles. Destroyers sailed almost into the surf to fire point blank at the bunkers. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies were ashore. A toehold, bloody, fragile, but real. The Atlantic Wall, the impregnable masterpiece of German engineering, had been cracked open within a single day by a coalition of grocers and shopkeepers commanded by a man from Kansas. And somewhere in a trailer in southern England, Eisenhower quietly took the letter from his wallet, the one accepting all blame for failure, and slipped it into a drawer. He would not throw it away. He carried the memory of it for the rest of his life. In the years that followed, the world would give him everything. 5 stars, the presidency, statues, streets, schools. But none of it would ever quite reach the quiet, lonely place inside him where that decision lived. History tends to remember the loud men, the MacArthurs with their corncob pipes, the Pattons with their pearl-handled revolvers, the Montgomerys with their berets and their certainties. But the war did not need those men at the top. The war needed a different kind of leader. It needed a man who could absorb the egos of empires, who could soothe a Frenchman's pride, and a Briton's suspicion, and an American's bravado, all in the same afternoon. It needed a man who could shoulder the weight of 150,000 lives and still say, in a calm Kansas voice, "Okay, let us go." The system, the old officer class, the West Point traditionalists, had never wanted a politician general. They wanted warriors. But the war, in its terrible wisdom, demanded something rarer. It demanded a man who would write a letter taking the blame before the blame had even arrived. A man who would weep, privately, for boys he had never met. A man who understood, deeply and personally, that leadership is not the glory of giving orders. It is the loneliness of bearing their consequences. Eisenhower never bragged about D-Day. He rarely spoke of it. When pressed, in his later years, he would only say that he had been very lucky and that the soldiers had done the real work. He meant it. He always meant it. That, perhaps, is the truest measure of the man. Not the wall he broke, not the empire of egos he managed, but the silence he kept afterward, knowing what it had cost, knowing what could have been lost, knowing that history had given him one impossible choice, and he had answered it with 4 small words on a rainy night in June. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If you found something meaningful here, please consider giving the video a like. It genuinely helps the channel reach more people who care about history told this way. Subscribe if you would like more deep dives into the moments and the men who shaped the modern world. And in the comments below, I would love to hear your honest view. Do you believe Eisenhower's decision on that storm-lashed night was the single greatest gamble of the entire war? Or was there another moment, another commander, another impossible choice that you believe deserves that title? Tell me your thoughts. I read them all. Until next time.